I first noticed something was wrong the night the floorboards groaned beneath a weight that wasn't mine. I had been poring over faded letters in the lamplight, the air in my flat tasting of old paper and rain-soaked cobblestones, when the knock came, a soft, deliberate rap against the hallway door. My heart jerked, though I lived alone. The hallway beyond was empty, but at its end, where the flimsy mirror leaned against peeling wallpaper, I saw movement. My reflection hesitated, as though breath had caught in its chest. And then it didn't copy my raised hand, but lingered halfway, fingers curled. A shiver rattled through me, the temperature dropping so sharply that my breath bloomed in tiny clouds. I approached, footsteps muffled by threadbare carpet, every nerve alight. The mirror's surface smudged with a fine layer of dust, yet the reflection was unnaturally clear. Too clear. I reached out, fingertips grazing the glass's cool face, and the other me smiled, slow and knowing, lips parting to whisper words I couldn't quite hear. I recoiled, heart hammering, but curiosity pinned me in place. Had I imagined the expression, or had that shadow self's eyes glinted with a purpose of their own? The next morning, sunlight revealed fresh footprints scuffing the parquet, leading up to the mirror and back, though the rain had washed away any sign of a visitor at the door. My rational mind sketched explanations, drafts, shifting foundations, but beneath rationality, a pulse of dread throbbed. I started noticing more. Objects subtly moved, the scent of ozone in the corner of my study, as if a storm brewed behind closed shutters, and always the mirror. Each night, it grew more insistent, calling to me with those impossible reflections. I tried to ignore it, busying myself with work, but the mirror's presence crept into my dreams. I woke gasping, tangled in sheets damp with sweat, and something else, fear. When I glanced at the mirror before rising, my reflection was sweetly complacent. Lips curved into a peaceful smile that felt alien. I wasn't the same in my own skin anymore. I felt hollowed, as though pieces of myself had already slipped into that glass world. Yet I could not turn away. The doppelganger waited, patient as a spider, beckoning me toward a truth I was only beginning to suspect. This thing in the mirror was no mere illusion, and whatever it wanted from me would demand everything I had. I began keeping a record of each anomaly, scrawling frantic notes into a leather-bound journal whose pages smelled of resin and rain. Every night, the mirror forced my eyes open with that groan of shifting floorboards, and I would stumble into its pale glow. I noticed first that its surface felt slightly warmer than glass should, like the skin of something alive. At midnight, when the city outside lay muffled by fog, I pressed my palm to its smooth face and felt a tremor run through my bones, as if whatever existed behind the glass acknowledged my touch. My breath caught at the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, the promise of lightning before a thunderstorm. One morning, I awoke to find a message etched on the mirror's underside in fine silvery cracks. Remember. The word shimmered as I circled the glass, fingertips tracing the delicate fissures. It was not my handwriting, yet I recognized the curve of each letter. My own when I was younger, and cursive came more easily. A sudden chill filled the room, and the mirror's reflection slid into place. My face pale and wide-eyed, but the eyes were not mine. They glinted with knowledge, as though they had watched me long before I first lived here. My days blurred into restless wandering through antique shops and dusty archives, searching for any history of the building or its former tenants. Most records were lost. The hallways of the registry smelled of mildew and paper that had never known sunlight. But in a brittle ledger, I uncovered one entry. A man vanished without a trace in 1923. Last seen gazing into a full-length mirror. I felt the blood drain from my face, the hairs on my neck prickling with ice. The stakes had sharpened. This was not my first encounter with the mirror, but perhaps my last chance to understand its purpose before I, too, dissolved into its reflection. That night, I drew a circle of salt around the frame, lit a single candle scented with juniper and ash, and whispered questions into the glass. The flame flickered, casting quivering shadows that danced like specters across the walls. From the mirror came a rasping inhalation, a breath not mine, and then the faintest of sighs. My heart thundered. There was no turning back now. Whose voice would come next? And what price would I pay to hear the answer? I woke to the taste of ash on my tongue and the lingering echo of my own voice, calling out in a tone I did not recognize. The mirror stood at the foot of my bed like a silent judge. Moonlight fractured through the cracked window pane, casting jagged lines across its surface. I reached for the candle stub on the nightstand, its wick stubborn and unlit, and felt the room's air thicken as though weighted with regret. Every breath was an act of will. Against my better judgment, I approached the mirror and pressed my palm to its center, where the veins of cracks now spidered into the salt circle's edge. The glass rippled like water disturbed, and I stumbled back, lantern toppling, spilling molten wax across the floorboards. The pooled wax hissed, releasing a scent of scorched pine, and the mirror began to pulse with a pale inner glow. In its depths, I saw not one reflection, but two. Myself and something that looked like me, but older, wearier, clothes dirtied with earth from graves long unmarked. The older me raised a finger and wrote a word on the fogged glass. Forgive. Then the floor groaned, and the mirror's frame seemed to inhale, drawing light and sound into itself. I pressed my ear to the wood, hearing faint, guttural cries. Pleas for mercy, maybe, or warning. Panic flared. I knew this was the point of no return. I could flee, leave the question of the mirror unanswered, but I felt the mirror gripping my mind, a slow pulse tugging me forward. I closed my eyes and let the candle's flame guide my trembling hand. When I looked again, the reflection had shifted. The older self was gone, replaced by a blank space, an absence that felt heavier than presence. My own face stared back, eyes wide with terror, eyes I no longer recognized. I leaned in closer, breath misting the glass, and whispered, "What do you want from me?" Silence answered, but beneath it, I heard the sound of floorboards groaning under an unseen weight, and I understood that the mirror's hunger would not be sated until I fed it my very self. The choice lay before me: surrender or uncover the truth that would change me forever. I spent the next evening gathering every scrap of research I could find, tacking yellowed clippings and torn journal pages to the walls around the mirror, forming a grid of questions and half-answers lit by a single flickering lamp. The air grew heavy, as though the room itself braced for something terrible. I traced the life of the missing man, his wife's letter begging him to return, his landlord's note reporting strange noises, the final police supplement marking the date of his disappearance. Each fragment of truth felt like a blade sliding deeper into my chest. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection watched me with patient curiosity, as if it counted my mounting desperation. I decided to speak aloud the man's name, Edmund Larkins, believing that naming might anchor the spirit I felt locked behind the glass. My voice trembled, and the mirror rippled, bending the candlelight into long, quivering shadows. The temperature plummeted. My breath condensed into icy pearls that fell to the floorboards with a crystalline tinkle. Beneath the shiver of cold, I heard, faint but unmistakable, a second heartbeat. My own, slowed and deliberate, echoing from the other side. With trembling hands, I pressed my journal against the mirror's frame and whispered, "Edmund, if you're here, show me." My reflection tilted its head, lips parting into a sad, rueful smile. And then it stepped forward, pressed its hand to the glass from the inside, and I felt the board behind me groan as though something immense had shifted weight. Panic flared. The salts I poured around the frame yesterday lay cracked, and I realized the barrier was weakening. My goal crystallized. I had to understand its logic before it spilled through. I set about constructing a makeshift barrier of my own. Coils of rope and lengths of chalk-drawn sigils scavenged from the ledger. Every precise line carried the musty scent of chalk dust and wet stone. I chanted words found in a forgotten footnote, phrases half Latin, half prayer, so that I could bind the entity until I unraveled its purpose. The mirror's surface glowed, veins of light crawling beneath the glass like living roots. My voice grew steadier with each verse, though sweat beaded at my temples, and my chest ached with the effort of believing in words barely more than guesses. When I finished, the mirror fell silent. The glow faded, replaced by the dull gleam of ordinary glass. Relief surged, but I hesitated to step back. My reflection gave no answer. I touched the surface one last time, fingers trembling through the rope's coarse fibers, and found only cold, dead glass. And yet somewhere in the quiet, I sensed a question hanging between us. A challenge that dared me to break the barrier or risk being broken myself. I realized then that this was my point of no return. If I shattered the mirror, I might free Edmund, or I might imprison myself forever. Either way, nothing would be the same. I sank to my knees before the mirror, the rope and chalk sigils torn asunder, the scent of powdery chalk and damp rope filling my nostrils. I pressed my palms to the glass one last time and felt heat bloom through my fingertips, alive, urgent, insistent. The air around me crackled with static, like the charged hush before a summer storm, and I heard that second heartbeat again, resonant and slow, as though the mirror itself had a pulse. I closed my eyes, breathing in the smell of wet earth and old paper, and let myself remember who I once was, a skeptical man who prized rationality above all, who believed the past was dead and buried. I opened my eyes to see the reflection smile, and in that smile was every regret I had ever buried, every untold apology, every lost promise. I spoke Edmund Larkin's name as a benediction and a farewell. The mirror's surface rippled, drawing light and shadow into vortices that swirled like restless spirits. I felt a tug in my chest, as though my own reflection reached out to draw me across the threshold. Panic flared, but I held fast. "Go," I whispered. "Be free." The glass exhaled a sigh, low, mournful, and the scene behind it shifted. I saw Edmund stepping back into the world, dusty coat, weary eyes, but alive. In that instant, I realized the mirror's cruel gift. It had trapped him by trapping me, because I refused to forgive the past. As his hand pressed against the inner face of the glass, he winked at me. Not in thanks, but in understanding. And then the pane fractured, splintering into a web of cracks that glowed with soft blue light, and my reflection slipped through the fissures to occupy his place. I staggered as the glass cooled against my skin. A sudden cold spot bloomed at my heart. When the shards settled, I was standing alone before an empty frame. The only thing left was a single crack, curling across the floorboards, humming with possibility. I felt different, lighter, yet haunted by a memory that was no longer mine. In freeing Edmund, I had invited something of me into that silent world. Now I carry both our stories in my bones, a reminder that identity is never fixed, but forged in acts of mercy and sacrifice. And every time I catch my reflection at the edge of my vision, I wonder whether I am the man I once was, or the man I have become. I found the camera tucked beneath a pile of moth-eaten jackets at a dusty flea market stall. its worn leather case giving off the sharp, bittersweet scent of old tobacco and damp cloth. The vendor's eyes flickered with something unreadable as he pressed it into my hands, whispering only, "It sees what isn't yet." Back in my apartment, I loaded a fresh pack of Polaroid film and felt the familiar click of the shutter release, the mechanical heartbeat of an object built for ghosts. I pointed it at the rain-slicked street beyond my window and watched the image emerge. Pale streetlights reflecting on puddles, a solitary figure glancing my way, except the date stamped at the bottom read tomorrow. My pulse thundered in my ears, the room tilting on its hinges as the hairs on my neck stood to attention. I ripped the photo free, breath ragged, and ran back the next morning to find the exact scene replayed, complete with a spilled coffee cup at the corner cafe. The camera's chemical aroma, sharp and metallic, clung to my fingers, and I knew I had crossed into something that should not exist. I held the device against my chest, the silence in the room suddenly heavy with possibility, and understood that I could no longer ignore the future it unfolded before me. It demanded answers, and I was already too enthralled to walk away. I woke before dawn the next morning, the hush of the apartment pressing against my ears like a held breath. The camera lay on the bedside table, its leather strap coiling around my wrist as I reached for it. I crept to the window and raised the lens to the glass, focusing on the empty street bathed in sodium lamp glow. Click. The Polaroid ejected, whirring with cold chemical scent. I watched the image bloom, the same earliest light, but at its center a silhouette hunched over the gutter, rain washing over dark, dripping hair. My pulse thudded as I realized it wasn't a stranger. It was me, crouched where no one had yet walked. The date printed read 2 days ahead. My breath caught. I tucked the developing photo into my pocket and dressed in record time. Every floorboard groan magnified as I raced down the stairwell. Outside, the night air was sharp with the promise of rain, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant ozone. I paced toward the spot in the photo, heart hammering, only to find emptiness. No figure, no shadow, just the hush of early morning. My reflection trembled in a shop window as I passed. I raised the camera again, hands slick with sweat, and fired at my own mirrored image. When the photo emerged, I stared until my vision blurred. Behind me in the glass was the figure, me, staring back with eyes wide in silent terror. The date read 3 days from now. Panic knotted my gut. I realized then that the camera wasn't merely showing moments to come. It was mapping my descent into something I couldn't yet fathom. Yet I could not stop. The next image might hold the key to breaking the cycle, or it might mark the moment I lost myself forever. That evening, the air inside my flat felt heavy, as if charged by the camera's unseen mechanics. I set up a single bulb in the corner and placed the Polaroid on the table, its glossy back still damp with the last image. Every breath tasted faintly of metal and ozone. I loaded another frame, my hands trembling, and pointed the lens toward the unlit hallway. Click. The flash cracked like a whip. When the photo slipped free, I watched the image materialize. The hallway, yes, but at its end, a door stood ajar, one I knew was nailed shut. And beyond it, a sliver of a child I did not recognize, face turned toward me with hollow eyes. The date read 4 days hence. Panic throbbed behind my ribs. I bolted from the table and crossed to the hall, each floorboard groaning beneath my weight. The door was sealed. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard nothing but silence thick with dust and memory. A cold spot bloomed at my collarbone, and the camera in my pocket pulsed like a heartbeat. I realized then that the future it showed was not fixed, but a warning. I could choose to follow its path or break it. I spent hours pacing the apartment, reviewing every shot, cataloging each detail until the night grew thin and tremulous. My reflection in the window stared back with wide, sleepless eyes, and I understood. To escape the fate painted by the Polaroid, I must walk into that sealed door 4 days from now and confront whatever waits behind it. There would be no turning back. The morning of the 4th day dawned in a low, gray light that seeped through drawn curtains like a warning. I ran my fingers over the camera's worn leather case, its edges soft from use, and felt the weight of every shutter click pressing into my skin. The apartment was unnaturally silent. No hum of the heater, no distant traffic. Just the faintest tremor in the floorboards, as if something paced below. I dressed slowly, each garment brushing my skin with a clammy chill, and carried the Polaroid down the narrow hallway. At the sealed door, I paused. My breath came in shallow gusts, and the air smelled of ozone and old metal. I knelt to trace the outline of the planks nailed across the frame, heart hammering so loudly I feared it would shatter the wood. With a breath, I pressed the camera to my chest and shoved. The boards groaned, the door trembled. A cold spot bloomed at my feet, creeping up my spine like liquid frost. I retrieved the last film pack from my jacket pocket. 2 shots left. Click. The flash flickered in the dim hall, and the Polaroid sizzled to life, revealing the door slightly ajar, a sliver of ragged wallpaper peeling back to expose dark void beyond. I stared, breath caught, as a dark shape within shifted, a child's silhouette turning toward me with empty eyes. No date stamped this time, only silence. My hands trembled on the splintered wood. The point of no return lay beyond. I straightened, camera ready, and pushed the door wider, every nerve alight. What waited inside would change everything. I pushed the door the final inch, and it swung inward with a groan that shook the walls. Beyond lay a small nursery frozen in dust. A broken crib, a lone toy car rusted at the wheel, wallpaper peeling in jagged strips like injured skin. The air tasted of damp earth and old smoke, as though the room itself had never shaken off a long-ago fire. Footsteps creaked behind me, though the floorboards were bare, and a sudden cold spot bloomed against my spine, sharp as a blade. I raised the camera with shaking hands and fired. The flash snapped like lightning in a sealed cave, illuminating the corner where a small figure stood. A child in a singed dress, hair matted, eyes fixed on me with a hollow, pleading look. My stomach clenched as I watched the Polaroid develop. The date already printed was today, but beneath it lay only darkness. The child stepped forward, its footfalls echoing in the frozen nursery. Each step burned my mind with revelation. The camera didn't merely show the future, it summoned it. Every image I'd taken had bound me closer to this moment, and now I stood at the precipice of the tragedy I was destined to replay. The ghost reached out, transparent hand trembling like dying embers, and I realized with sudden clarity that this was no accident of fate, but a cycle I had begun. My goal snapped into focus. I could not retreat into ignorance. I had to break the lens that trapped these lost echoes. With a cry that caught in my throat, I brought the camera down against the wooden crib. It cracked, shuddered, and fell apart in my grip. Springs and shards of glass clattering across the floor. The nursery trembled, dust raining from the ceiling, and the child's form flickered, caught between relief and sorrow. In that fractured light, the ghost's face softened into something like gratitude. The cold spot released its hold, leaving only a hollow ache where dread had lived. The Polaroid lay at my feet, now blank, as though it had never borne witness. I understood then that knowledge can be a prison as much as it is a gift, that some futures demand a price too high to pay. I stepped back through the hallway, camera parts dangling from my fingertips, and closed the door gently behind me. The silence was different now, lighter, almost forgiving. I slipped the shards of leather and glass into a paper bag and buried them in the garden beneath the old oak. And as the soil covered them, I felt part of the curse lift. I first heard the lullaby on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, long before I knew its name. I was unpacking boxes in the attic of my grandmother's old house, dust dancing in the weak sunlight, the smell of mothballs and damp wood heavy in the air, when I spotted it half buried under yellowed newspapers, a small, tarnished music box shaped like a miniature carousel. My fingers brushed its cold brass surface, and I felt a slight thrum beneath the metal, as if it were still wound tight from some long-forgotten twist of the key. I wound it out of curiosity, expecting a cracked spring or silence, but instead a single, trembling note rang out, soft and warped. Then another and another, until the carousel horses began their silent, impossible dance. The sound was achingly familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood, a melody I felt in my bones but could not place in my mind. As it played, the attic floorboards moaned under an unseen weight, and I smelled ozone and old velvet, a scent that carried with it a pulse of something urgent, alive. At first, I told myself it was nostalgia, the house's thick air bending memory into a phantom song. But when I set the box down, the tune lingered in my ears, echoing through empty shelves and ducking behind cobwebbed trunks. I climbed down the narrow ladder, the walls closing in around me, and carried the music box into the hallway, where the light from the window caught a crack in its lid, revealing a sliver of handwritten inscription, "Lullaby for the Lost." My heart stuttered. Lost. The word pried at something buried, an absence so deep I could almost feel it churning in my throat. I tucked the box under my arm and tiptoed down the creaking staircase, each step alive with the box's echo. By the time I reached the dusty living room, its melody had grown imperceptibly slower, as if the box itself hesitated to show me more. I paused under the chandelier, its crystals dull and lifeless, and wondered why my grandmother, a stoic woman who rarely spoke of her past, would hide this in the shadows above. I realized then that my search for answers had already begun. I cradled the music box against my chest, as if it were a fragile heart of its own, and I understood with sharp clarity that nothing would ever be the same once the next note slipped into silence. I spent the rest of the afternoon rifling through my grandmother's things, old diaries, brittle letters tied with faded ribbon, a collection of photographs of children I didn't recognize, their eyes hollow with unspoken sorrow. Every time I reached for something, the music box's faint, unplaceable hum seemed to pulse through the walls, as though it were calling me back upstairs. I paused in the corridor, breath catching, and noticed the air turn sickly sweet, like overripe fruit in damp earth. My skin prickled with a sudden chill, and the floorboards groaned behind me, though I was alone. I hugged the box tighter, determined to learn who had wound it last. By dusk, I had unearthed a yellowed journal tucked behind a boarded-up section of the attic wall. Its leather cover crackled under my fingertips, and the pages exhaled a musty breath as I opened it. In elegant script, my grandmother wrote of a lullaby she had first heard as a child, played for her by a distant relative she could never name at dusk falls in a hidden room. She described the same ozone scent, the cold spots, the carousel's ghostly rotation. She called it the song that remembers you, and warned that once you listened, you could never unhear its secrets. My heart hammered. I read her final entry, dated 60 years ago. Tonight I will lock the box away. Tomorrow, I may not remember why. Night came quickly in that old house, swallowing the windows until only the glow of a single lamp pierced the gloom. I carried the journal and music box into the study, hoping the familiar comfort of books lining shelves would steady me. But as I opened the box, its lid creaked dust into the lamplight, and the lullaby began again. Slower this time, each note stretched, distorting like a reflection in rippling water. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. Once you listen, you can never unhear. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the melody seeped through bone and sinew, threading into my heartbeat. Suddenly, the music halted, leaving behind a residue of silence so dense it pressed against my eardrums. In that stillness, I heard something else. A soft scuffle behind the bookcase. My breath caught in my chest. I told myself it was rats, or the house settling. But the hairs on my neck rose as a single floorboard groaned under weight. Not mine. The room grew cold, unbearably cold, and the lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing like mournful dancers across the spines of books. I forced my legs to move toward the sound, each step hesitant, each breath visible in the freezing air. I reached the bookcase and found a narrow gap, just wide enough for a hand. I slid the journal into the opening, and the wood shifted, revealing a hidden door. My pulse thundered in my ears. The box vibrated in my grip, as though urging me not to proceed, but I needed the truth. I yanked the door open and peered into darkness deeper than night itself. A faint, pulsating glow emanated from within, blue-green light that smelled of metal and earth. The lullaby began again, muffled, distant, as if traveling up from some subterranean chamber. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The hidden room was small, its walls slick with damp, and at its center stood a makeshift cradle draped in moth-eaten cloth. On its mattress lay a torn scrap of faded fabric with my grandmother's initials faintly stitched in one corner. The music box rested atop a low pedestal beside the cradle, its brass now gleaming as though newly polished. I felt my breath freeze in my lungs. I realized the cradle had held something alive once. Someone whose lullaby had become a trap, a tether pulling generations back into this hidden place. I reached out to touch the box, but a sudden gust of frigid air snuffed out the glow and plunged me into pitch black. The melody swelled behind my eyes, louder, urgent. My goal to uncover the lullaby's origin had brought me here, but I had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The cradle creaked. A whisper of breath grazed my ear. The last thing I felt was the music's cold caress. And then I knew I was no longer merely its listener, but its next keeper. The darkness pressed against my eyelids like damp cloth, and I realized with a start that I was kneeling beside the cradle, the music box still clutched in my trembling hand. My breathing echoed off the stone walls, each exhale a mist in the frigid air. The lullaby seeped upward from the box now, slower, each warped note winding around me in invisible coils. I dared to lift the lid. Inside, the tiny carousel horses were gone. Only a faint imprint in the tarnished brass remained, as if they had never existed. A low groan rattled the hidden door behind me. I spun to see it inch shut on silent hinges. Panic flared, sharp and immediate. The cradle creaked again, though its wood was long rotted. I pressed my palm to its surface and felt a pulse, soft, childlike, beneath the arid dust. My skin prickled with sympathy, then dread. I understood. This room was alive with memory, its walls storing every tear, every whispered prayer. A distant drip of water marked time unkindly. I settled the box on the cradle's edge and slid the journal from my pocket, flipping to the last entry where my grandmother had scrawled a line in jagged ink. The song remembers the child who never grew. The words ignited something in me, an ache I had never known I carried. My grandmother's own loss, buried beneath years of silence, had woven itself into this melody. The lullaby was not a trap, but a promise. Remember, or be remembered forever. The temperature dropped again. and I shivered, fighting the tremor in my fingertips as I wound the box once more. The first note rang out, crisp and unbroken. I closed my eyes, breathed in the scent of ozone and old velvet, and let the song transport me into the heart of a memory that was not mine, of a child's lullaby echoing through an empty house, hoping to be heard. When the melody ended, I knew what I had to do. The cradle's boards groaned under an unseen weight as I rose, resolve hardening inside me. I would unlock the forgotten sorrow at the core of this song, even if it meant laying down my own. Only then could the lullaby rest, and I too find release. I waited until the moon had crept low in the attic window, its pale light pooling like liquid silver across the cradle's ragged cloth. The air was heavy with damp earth and the faint metallic tang of ozone. I set the music box on the cradle's edge and wound it one final time, my fingers slick with sweat. The first note trembled through the silence, and the hidden door behind me groaned open, as though granting passage to something that had only ever waited. I felt an almost electrical charge ripple through my arm, the lullaby's heartbeat in my veins. The attic grew colder still, and I could see my breath swirl in halos before me. I knelt beside the cradle and pressed the box's lid flat, listening to each elongated note. Then I remembered a line from my grandmother's diary: "Sing for her, and she will follow the song home." My voice caught as I began to hum the lullaby, hesitant at first, then with gathering strength, matching the warped cadence of the music box. The floorboards vibrated under an invisible pressure. The cradle rocked. A soft sigh brushed my ear, a child's breath drawn too deeply. My heart pounded so loud I feared it would shatter the melody. In the wavering moonlight, I saw her. A small, half-transparent figure perched on the cradle's edge, her head tilted, eyes hollow yet pleading. The scent of old lace and lilacs drifted through the narrow room. Every sorrow I had ever buried rose in my chest, a tide of empathy and loss. I closed my eyes and finished the lullaby, my voice cracking on the last note. The music box stuttered, then stilled. She reached out, her tiny hand brushing mine, colder than midnight air but gentle as a moth's wing. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. In the hollow silence, I felt the cradle lighten, as if grief itself had been lifted. The attic no longer felt oppressive but open, as though a weight had been released. I realized then that the song had not been a trap, but an echo of a love that refused to fade. I gathered the music box to my chest, its brass warm in my arms, and climbed down into the night with a heart reshaped by memory and mercy. By the time I stepped back into the silent hallway, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the grimy window panes, staining the air a pale gold, and I realized I was no longer the person who climbed those attic stairs. The music box lay heavy in my palm, its weight a reminder of the sorrow I had released, and the responsibility I now carried. I paused, inhaling the damp, lavender-tinged air that lingered from the hidden room, and felt a tender resolve settle in my chest. My fear had given way to a quiet compassion. I understood now that memory is more than a record. It is a promise we keep to those we've loved and lost. As I wound the box one last time, its melody came not as an echo of grief, but as an invitation to remember with kindness, to honor the past without letting it consume the present. And in that gentle, haunting tune, I found a purpose I had never known: to become the keeper of stories, the guardian of echoes that would otherwise fade into oblivion. The attic grew still once more, not empty, but alive with renewed possibility. The first letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It was nestled among bills and advertisements, its paper yellowed and brittle, as if aged decades in mere days. I held the envelope for a long moment, confused by its weightlessness. its air of quiet urgency whispering at the edge of perception. Carefully tearing it open, my fingertips brushing the fragile paper, I unfolded a single sheet covered in looping, elegant handwriting. My handwriting. The breath caught in my throat as I read the date at the top. Yesterday. The words described my morning in unsettling detail, down to the forgotten coffee growing cold on my desk, the gray pigeon perched on my windowsill, and even the faint scent of lavender from the soap I'd chosen on a whim. I lowered the letter, pulse quickening, ears ringing softly as if the air itself had grown taut with expectation. How could this be? Had I written it, somehow forgotten, sleepwalking through reality? I set the letter aside, dismissing it as a strange joke or a bizarre lapse in memory, though a shadow of unease lingered deep within my bones. But the letters continued, each morning bringing another envelope, always dated precisely one day earlier. They narrated my life with frightening precision, down to fleeting thoughts I'd shared with no one, capturing even the flicker of uncertainty I felt upon glancing at my reflection, or the peculiar creak of my floorboards as if someone unseen paced restlessly in my shadow. The letters knew too much. They knew everything. Days blurred together as dread crept into my routine, each envelope heavier than the last, despite their physical weightlessness. The scent of aged paper filled my apartment, blending with the ever-present aroma of coffee and stale rain from the city outside. Nights grew longer, colder, filled with whispers that seemed to drift in from nowhere, and mornings found me red-eyed, hollow, reluctant to face the day's mail. It wasn't until the fifth letter arrived that I realized they contained more than just details of my days. They subtly began to change, offering glimpses into things that hadn't happened, shouldn't happen. And in this newest note, beneath the meticulous descriptions of yesterday's trivialities, lay a single, chilling sentence: "Tomorrow, you'll lose everything." The paper trembled in my hands. My apartment seemed to close around me, walls pressing inward, air thickening like mist. A sudden draft whispered through the room, rustling the stack of letters beside me as though stirred by a passing breath. Something unseen shifted in the corner behind me, the floorboards groaning under its silent weight. I stood frozen, heart racing, as a cold, almost damp sensation brushed the back of my neck, a presence standing impossibly close yet intangible. My eyes darted toward the darkened hallway, ears straining against oppressive silence. I knew then with aching certainty that these letters were not warnings or predictions. They were memories, my memories, written by a version of myself trapped somewhere just beyond reach. And with that realization came another, more terrifying question. What had I done to become trapped in yesterday? Yet even as fear gripped me, another envelope slid silently beneath my apartment door, as if inviting me to discover what I had lost, or what I had yet to lose. The new letter lay motionless by my door, its presence emanating an inexplicable gravity that made the simple act of approaching it feel monumental. I crouched slowly, knees protesting with faint creaks that mingled with the mournful whisper of rain against my window. As I lifted the envelope, my fingertips recoiled slightly at the clammy chill of the paper, as though it had absorbed a dampness deeper and older than the rain outside. The hallway seemed to darken around me, the shadows sharpening at the corners of my vision. The gentle patter of rain had become a rhythmic pulse of apprehension, each droplet tapping relentlessly upon my nerves. Sliding open the envelope revealed a page identical to the others, delicate and thin, as if composed of pressed ashes. Again, my handwriting greeted me, meticulous, neat, and utterly haunting. I read slowly, eyes widening with each sentence, breath hitching painfully in my chest. The words described today with absolute precision. My hesitation before the mailbox, the distant tolling of a church bell I'd barely noticed, even the faint metallic taste of anxiety coating my tongue. But at the end, new words appeared. Today, you must choose. Yesterday waits for no one. My mind spun, heart thrumming unevenly. Choose? Choose what? My future, my past, my reality itself. I stared numbly at the letter, a quiet dread settling over me like a funeral shroud, suffocating and inevitable. The boundaries between memory and prophecy, past and future, were dissolving, leaving me lost in an endless maze of uncertainty. Yet, beneath the confusion, a single truth emerged clear as ice. Whatever force bound me to these letters had offered me an escape, at a cost I feared to imagine. Days had become indistinct and muted, the hours smeared like charcoal sketches blurred by rain. My life was unraveling beneath the weight of knowledge not meant to be held. In those quiet moments of solitude, an awareness prickled at the edges of my senses, whispers drifting softly as though carried by a current of air. My apartment felt alien, subtly altered, like returning home after many years only to find someone had rearranged furniture that hadn't moved at all. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old wooden floors beneath the carpeting made my eyes snap open, staring into shadows pooling thicker each night. I would listen to those unseen footsteps, heavy yet intangible, moving deliberately through my rooms, pausing now and then, as if to examine the relics of my past life. Occasionally, a fleeting scent of damp earth and ozone wafted through the apartment, as if a storm brewed silently within these walls, unseen yet profoundly felt. It was then, in the hours before dawn, that I found the courage, or perhaps desperation, to search for answers. Gathering the letters, I spread them across my table, hands trembling. There had to be a pattern, a clue buried beneath the meticulous descriptions. I pored over each line, each word, desperately trying to connect dots that shifted every time I thought I'd grasped them. And there, finally, I noticed something strange. Certain words, when read vertically, formed a hidden sentence, subtle enough to miss, but undeniable once seen. The past claims what the future denies. My pulse quickened, my chest tightening painfully. The words resonated deeply, like an old truth I'd forgotten rather than newly discovered. They carried a weight that hinted at loss, regret, and perhaps redemption, if redemption were even possible. The floorboards behind me groaned deeply, interrupting my thoughts, and the air turned suddenly frigid. A tangible presence loomed close, heavy and sad, and though I dared not turn around, I knew it waited, watching silently. My voice cracked as I whispered into the void behind me, the quiet breaking with each trembling syllable. Who are you? What do you want? Silence. Only the faint hum of my refrigerator and the melancholy dripping of rain answered me. Yet even in the absence of reply, clarity began forming within me, shaping itself into a fragile, desperate purpose. I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that the letters weren't meant merely to torment me. They were guiding me towards something hidden, something buried deep in the lost corridors of yesterday, something I had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget. And to reclaim tomorrow, I would have to face whatever truth lay waiting in the darkness of my past. Morning arrived in shades of gray, a pallid dawn bleeding through curtains heavy with the scent of mildew and old rain. Sleep had eluded me entirely, my body exhausted but mind painfully alert, spinning relentlessly through fragments of half-forgotten memories and obscure hints buried in letters that spoke in riddles of yesterday. I stared blankly at the ceiling, tracing invisible cracks in the plaster, hearing the distant murmur of traffic as an indifferent world awoke, ignorant of the unraveling reality hidden within my walls. Today would be different, I promised myself. Today I would confront this encroaching madness. The letters had hinted at something deeper, something vital and long buried in the shadowy corridors of my past. a past I'd once thought safely forgotten, locked away like childhood toys in the attic of memory. But those secrets were stirring now, emerging from places I no longer controlled. As I rose and crossed the cold wooden floor to the desk, a subtle draft brushed my ankle, cool and whisper-soft, as if a sigh had escaped from beneath the floorboards themselves. My fingertips grazed the stack of letters, each page rustling gently under my touch, filling the room with a faint but unmistakable aroma of damp earth and fading ink. I lifted the last envelope once more, studying the cryptic line I'd discovered. The past claims what the future denies. Those words resonated painfully, like a warning echoing through an empty house. A sudden resolve overcame my hesitation. I needed answers, and the only place left to look was inward, into my memories, into places I had consciously avoided for years. I found myself reaching instinctively toward the small wooden box hidden deep within my bedroom closet, the one containing relics of a former life. Photographs, faded journals, postcards from places I no longer recognized. I knelt, feeling the roughness of the carpet imprint upon my knees as I pulled the box free, its hinges protesting with a mournful creak. Inside, the musty odor of time flooded forth, pungent and heavy, layered with the ghostly scent of forgotten lavender sachets and aged paper. My heart quickened as my hands found a bundle of letters, old letters bound with brittle twine, letters I had never dared reread, letters from someone who had vanished from my life without explanation, whose loss had reshaped the very foundations of who I became. Slowly, carefully, I unfolded the first letter, the handwriting delicate and painfully familiar, the ink a faded whisper from years ago. My pulse hammered unevenly in my throat as I read words I'd purposefully forgotten, promises made and broken, dreams shared and discarded. And then I saw it, hidden in plain sight, a phrase I knew intimately now, though it had meant nothing then. The past claims what the future denies. A cold, paralyzing wave swept through me. These weren't just echoes of past love or regret. They were warnings, messages sent across time by someone who knew exactly what I'd become. Someone who knew my choices had created fractures, splinters in reality itself. Someone trying desperately to prevent me from repeating history. A sudden noise jolted me from my reverie, the unmistakable groan of floorboards shifting beneath the weight of an unseen presence. I turned sharply, breath catching painfully, every nerve alight with raw anticipation. The room around me dimmed unnaturally, shadows coalescing into shapes too human to dismiss, yet too ephemeral to fully see. "You're here, aren't you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, tinged with both fear and hope. The answer came not as words, but as a sensation, a profound, sorrowful longing that filled the air, thick and palpable, pressing upon my chest like grief. Tears burned in my eyes, unbidden yet unavoidable, as an invisible hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, a touch gentle and achingly familiar. Recognition surged through me, undeniable and devastating. "You've been here all along," I murmured, my heart fracturing under the weight of realization. "You've always been here." And as I knelt there, letters scattered around me like autumn leaves, I knew with a dreadful certainty that my journey was far from over, that I was no longer merely reading letters from yesterday, but actively rewriting my tomorrow. The presence lingered silently, saturating the room with an aching melancholy that pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat beneath the quiet hum of the city outside. My fingertips brushed the letters scattered across the floor, their paper cold now, brittle beneath my touch, and their words heavier still. Memories surged forward in waves, relentless tides washing away my carefully constructed barriers. The invisible figure behind me exhaled softly, and I felt the whisper of that breath glide along my neck. Unbearably familiar, unbearably sad. Tears stung my eyes as understanding pierced the veil of my denial. It was you, impossible yet undeniable. In the stillness, your name broke free from my lips, a soft invocation barely louder than a heartbeat. Anna, saying it aloud for the first time in years, felt like shattering glass within my chest, splinters scattering through my soul. I turned slowly, half expecting to see you standing there, unchanged and forgiving. But only shadows filled the space where you should have been. Yet your presence lingered, enveloping me in memories so vivid they ached. I remembered the fragrance of your hair after rain, the warmth of your laughter, the bitter, hollow silence of your sudden, inexplicable disappearance. For years, I had buried your memory beneath layers of numb routine, believing forgetting would ease the pain. But the past, I understood now, had never truly left. It merely waited patiently for me to confront the truth I had avoided for so long. The letters were not warnings. They were invitations, glimpses into realities shaped by choices made or unmade. I understood the stakes now. If I didn't face this, I would lose myself completely, trapped forever between yesterday and tomorrow, never fully alive in either. Determined, I stood and moved toward the bedroom, each step creaking mournfully beneath my weight, echoing softly as though marking the passage between worlds. I reached beneath the bed, retrieving an old photograph album covered in dust and regret. Its surface felt rough beneath my fingertips, carrying the scent of age and disuse. Gently opening the cover, my heart contracted painfully at images of us, smiling, carefree, oblivious to the fracture soon to follow. My chest tightened, breath shallow as the weight of our lost future pressed down upon me, smothering in its intensity. Then my fingers found something unexpected, an unopened envelope hidden beneath the final photograph. It trembled slightly in my hand, cold radiating outward like frost spreading across a window pane. I opened it with shaking fingers, pulling out a sheet of paper bearing handwriting distinctly yours, delicate yet purposeful. The date at the top froze me where I stood. Tomorrow. My pulse quickened as I read the letter, each word striking deep like a bell tolling in a distant chapel. You must remember to forget. Confusion swirled with dread inside me, paradox wrapped in paradox. Remember what? Forget what? Yet even as I questioned, realization flooded through me with brutal clarity. To reclaim my future, I had to confront the truth I'd locked away. The memory of that terrible day when everything changed. Closing my eyes, I felt the past rise within me, relentless and unforgiving. The wet pavement glistening beneath streetlights, your laughter echoing softly as we crossed the street hand in hand. The sudden blare of tires screeching on wet asphalt, the sickening, helpless moment when I turned, helpless to protect you, helpless to stop what followed. The memory seared through me now, vivid, agonizing, unstoppable. And then, the quiet afterward, a silence that stretched infinitely, punctuated only by the relentless patter of rain, cold as grief itself. I had denied that night for so long, hiding behind deliberate forgetfulness, constructing a false reality in which you'd merely vanished without explanation, a painless lie easier to bear. But now, confronted with truth raw and undeniable, the walls I'd built came crashing down, leaving only shattered remnants of the illusions I'd cherished. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, sobs wrenching free, grief finally finding its rightful place. As I surrendered fully to memory, the room shifted subtly around me, shadows withdrawing, the oppressive weight of melancholy lifting slightly, as though my acknowledgement had lessened its hold. I felt your presence brush gently against my skin once more, comforting yet fleeting, like the delicate warmth of sunlight filtering through clouds. It was a farewell, bittersweet and final, accepting and absolving. And within that quiet acceptance, I knew what tomorrow's letter meant. To move forward, I had to truly let go, not just of you, but of the self I had become in your absence. To forge a future not defined by loss, but by acceptance. Tomorrow waited, uncertain yet promising, if I could only find the courage to embrace it. But the past would claim me forever if I faltered now. The decision lay ahead, as daunting as it was necessary. As the lingering warmth of your unseen presence faded gently away, I gathered my strength, prepared at last to face whatever awaited me beyond this final, haunting letter from yesterday. Dawn broke softly through my window, pale tendrils of morning light dissolving the last remnants of shadows from my room. Yet despite the familiar warmth of day, the silence felt fragile, the air humming with unseen tension, the world waiting in breathless anticipation of my choice. The final letter sat untouched upon my desk, patient yet insistent, emanating a quiet urgency I could no longer deny. My heart thrummed unevenly as I approached, each step resonating through the room, echoing softly like a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds to a decision that would define my existence. The paper was ice beneath my fingertips, its surface charged with static, sending faint prickles up my arm. My breathing slowed, deepening deliberately, as if by controlling my breath, I might control fate itself. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope, unfolding the letter carefully, reverently, the sound of paper rustling unbearably loud in the profound stillness. The familiar handwriting greeted me once more, forming words I had expected yet feared all the same. Now choose, yesterday or tomorrow. The question echoed silently within me, demanding an answer I was terrified to give. My pulse quickened painfully as memories surged forward again, each image vivid, each emotion raw, pulling me toward the familiar agony of the past. Yesterday was Anna. Yesterday was loss and grief and comfort in sorrowful resignation. But tomorrow was unknown, uncertain, a path shrouded in darkness and possibility. Could I face such uncertainty, stripped of the familiar chains of grief I'd grown to accept? Suddenly, the apartment shivered around me, floorboards groaning loudly as if protesting under a heavy, unseen presence. A chill spread quickly through the room, the smell of damp earth mingling sharply with the fresh scent of morning. Cold pressed upon my back, whispering gently, insistently, guiding my attention toward the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, but gradually the surface shifted, revealing a shadow behind me, familiar yet alien, a silhouette crafted of regret and longing. I knew instantly it was you, Anna, not as a ghost, but as an echo, an imprint bound within my refusal to let go. Choose, your presence whispered softly, the air vibrating around me. Choose, or remain forever trapped in yesterday. In that moment, clarity pierced the fog of my indecision. I understood the cost of my denial, the harm my unwillingness to move forward had inflicted, not only upon myself, but upon the memory of the one I'd loved most. I'd been living half a life, clinging desperately to a past that no longer existed, imprisoning us both within an endless cycle of grief. I choose tomorrow, I said aloud, voice shaking but resolute. The words hung in the air, heavy yet freeing, powerful yet fragile, each syllable severing the invisible threads that had bound me for so long. As my decision echoed outward, the oppressive chill dissipated instantly, replaced by a gentle warmth. Your presence drew near, not to haunt, but to offer a final gesture of forgiveness. I felt your touch one last time, a tender warmth grazing my shoulder, lingering just long enough to reassure me before fading gracefully into memory. Tears filled my eyes, born not of sorrow, but of release, of profound gratitude for the love we had shared, and acceptance for the life I now had to embrace without you. The letters on the table began to fade, ink dissolving slowly into the page like smoke carried away on a gentle breeze, until only blank, aged paper remained. Silence settled gently around me, no longer oppressive but comforting, filled with quiet promise. My journey had changed me profoundly. No longer would I carry loss as a burden, but as a cherished part of my story, one that had shaped, rather than defined, who I was now determined to become. Slowly, purposefully, I moved to the window, opening it wide and breathing deeply the crisp air of a new morning. Sunlight warmed my face, bright and comforting, promising hope and renewal. The city stretched out before me, vibrant and alive, ready to welcome my first tentative steps into a future now unbound by the weight of unresolved grief. I moved into the old house on a rainy afternoon, the air inside stale with the scent of wet plaster and rotting wood. By the time night fell, each creak of the floorboards sounded amplified, as if something unseen prowled just out of sight. I sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, setting up my recorder to capture the faint hum of settling walls. But when I pressed record and leaned back, the silence thickened until I could almost taste it, metallic, like blood pooled under concrete. Then came the whisper, soft as a breath against my ear. "Michael." My heart lurched. I clenched the tape machine against my chest, convinced it was my own name. But I live alone. I replayed the tape immediately. Hiss, static, white noise that crawled under my skin and left me shivering. I twisted the dial, but all I found were random blips, fragments of syllables buried beneath the roar of tape. Nothing coherent. The room felt colder, an unnatural chill pooling at my ankles. Rising with each second I stared at the recorder's blinking red light. Outside, rain pounded the roof in irregular rhythms, a frantic percussion that seemed to echo the pounding in my chest. I stood and walked the dark hallway, flashlight beam trembling. The air smelled of damp earth and old secrets. I paused at the door to the attic, where I'd first heard the whisper. Silence greeted me, dense and suffocating. I pressed my hand to the cold doorknob. It felt alive, pulsing with a slow, measured beat. Another whisper, this time so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. But it was there, calling my name. I swallowed hard and lifted the recorder again, determined to capture the sound that lurked beyond human hearing. My rational mind warned me to stop, but something deeper pulled me forward, into the hushed promise of a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. The next night, I climbed into the attic, each step a muted protest as the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. My flashlight beam trembled against peeling wallpaper patterned with faded roses, revealing splinters of shattered glass scattered across stained floorboards. I paused, inhaling a scent of damp earth and something acrid, like ozone after lightning, clinging to the stagnant air. I set the recorder on an overturned crate and pressed record, my finger lingering on the button, as if reluctant to summon whatever lurked above. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the whisper returned, softer this time, threading through the silence with an almost tender cadence. "Why?" it asked. The single word cut through me, echoing off the rafters. I froze, breath shallow, as the attic dropped into a hush so deep it felt solid. I rewound the tape and played it back. Hiss, static, and that word, clear as a confession. My pulse thundered. I lifted the recorder to my ear, pressing play again, and heard another voice, a child's laugh, bright and distant, followed by a stifled sob that sent a shiver down my spine. I abandoned the recorder and let my hand trail along the dusty banister until I found a trap door nailed shut with rusty hinges. Heart pounding, I pried it open, the metal screeching like a cry of warning. Beneath lay a narrow crawl space, and the air that spilled out smelled of cold stone and old sorrow. I slid inside, claustrophobic and trembling, the beam of light bobbing over rough-hewn beams. Against the far wall, I discovered a scrap of yellowed paper pinned beneath a rusted nail, a fragment of a letter, its words half-faded but still legible. I tried to speak, but the house would not listen. A sudden gust rattled the boards above, and I heard footsteps pacing overhead, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I pressed my back against the rough wood and whispered, "Who are you?" The attic replied with a dry, rattling breath, and then nothing. No footsteps, no whisper, only the echo of my own voice hanging in the dark. I crawled back out, heart hammering, and knew I could not ignore this any longer. Someone, or something, had been trapped here, clawing to be heard, and I had to decide whether to listen. I spent the daylight hours poring over brittle newspaper clippings in the town archive, the musty scent of dust and ink clinging to my fingers as I traced every mention of the old Whitaker house. Most articles described a tragic fire in 1954, a child lost beneath collapsing beams. No name given, as if the paper itself recoiled from committing it to memory. The archivist's voice echoed in the empty hall. "They never found him," she said softly, eyes hollow. I left clutching a single photograph, a smiling boy in a stained dress shirt, his eyes pleading. That night, I placed the photo beside the recorder on the attic crate and pressed record. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere below. Then, a small voice, tremulous and hesitant. "Michael." The word floated through the attic like a moth beating wings against glass. My heart slammed. I leaned closer to the recorder, sweat cold on my brow, breath hitching as the temperature in the cramped space plummeted, my skin prickling with ice. "Who are you?" I whispered. A pause, then another word, barely audible. "Buried." I scrambled to my feet, every limb shaking, and shone the light toward the far corner where a loose floorboard lay half lifted. Beneath it, a patch of earth and charred debris peered through the gap. My pulse raced as the floor groaned under an unseen weight, as though someone, or something, shifted below, straining at the lid of its earthen grave. The voice came again, clearer now, urgent. "Help me!" I knew then that simply listening was no longer enough. To free him, I would have to descend into the house's darkest secret and face whatever had silenced that boy's voice for 70 years. There was no turning back. I knelt by the loose floorboard and pried it up with trembling fingers, the wood splintering with a groan that echoed through the silent house. A rush of cold, damp air escaped from the narrow cavity below, carrying the scent of wet earth and a faint tang of ozone, as if lightning lay buried alongside decay. I shone my flashlight into the fissure and saw, half buried in crumbling soil, the edge of a small wooden box blackened by fire. Heart hammering, I dragged it into the dim attic light. Ashes dusted its carved lid, and the grain felt slick under my palm, like the skin of something that had died long ago. With each breath, the temperature dropped, frost forming on my cheeks as I wrestled open the charred box. Inside lay a child's handkerchief, yellowed and stiff, and beneath it a tangle of tiny bones, brittle as dry twigs. My stomach lurched. The recorder crackled to life of its own accord, spitting static that coalesced into a soft voice. Here. The single word cut through me like glass. I pressed my hand to the bones, feeling a pulse of energy. Urgent. Desperate. The attic floor trembled under a weight unseen. A whisper followed. Free me. Tears blurred my vision, guilt and sorrow flooding together. I gathered the bones in both hands, the handkerchief slipping through my fingers like mist. The air hummed, charged with electricity, and I realized that I was the one who had been buried. My disbelief, my denial, locked beneath years of distance from my own past. I had to set this boy, and myself, free. But as I stood, clutching the fragile remains, the floorboards groaned again, louder, and the walls seemed to lean in, as if the house itself resented my trespass. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness pierced only by the dim glow of the recorder's red light. I took a steadying breath and whispered back, "I will." Then I climbed down through the rubble-strewn attic hatch, bones wrapped in the handkerchief against my chest, and stepped into the hallway below. With each footstep, memory cracked open like the splintered wood above. The point of no return lay just ahead, but I walked toward it, determined to bring light into the silence. I carried the fragile bundle of bones down the narrow corridor, each step reverberating like a heartbeat through the silent house. The hall's musty air closed in, pressing dampness against my lungs, and I felt the temperature drop as if the walls themselves mourned with me. I reached the study door, the only room untouched by rain and rot, and cleared a patch of floorboards where the earth beneath lay damp and soft. Kneeling, I unwound the handkerchief and gently laid the tiny remains into the shallow hollow, the soil swallowing them with a soft, wet sigh. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something sweet, like a child's laughter on the wind. I pressed my palm to the floor, feeling the faint echo of tiny bones brush against my skin. Then I spoke aloud every word I had learned in the attic. The boy's name, his mother's lullaby, my own apologies that I had never voiced. The air vibrated with a low hum, as though the room's breath steadied, and for a moment the world held its silence. Then the soil pulsed beneath my hand and the floorboards groaned, not with warning, but with release. Warmth flooded the corridor, dispelling the chill that had tracked me through each night. I stood, heart pounding, and watched as a pale shape coalesced in the fading glow of the lamp. No solid form, but a flicker of a smile and eyes alight with gratitude. The shape lingered a heartbeat, extended a tiny hand in farewell, and dissolved into the wood grain. In that instant, I understood. The whisper that had drawn me here was not simply a plea for freedom, but a call to remember compassion for forgotten souls and for myself. The skeptic I was has fallen away, replaced by someone who listens to the silences and believes in the voices that echo in empty rooms. If this story sent a chill through your bones, give it a like and whisper a subscribe to WhisperTales for your next nightly escape into anxious calm.